The late autumn wind whipped across the gray prairie grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Martha Edison's wagon axles snapped with a sound like gunfire, sending flour sacks tumbling onto the dusty earth. White powder scattered across the dried buffalo grass that lined the shallow creek bed, creating ghostly patterns in the fading light. She was still gathering the salvageable flour when 2 horsemen emerged from the dry gulch, their eyes gleaming with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with bread. The leader, a thick-necked man with tobacco-stained teeth, dismounted slowly, his gaze fixed not on the spilled goods, but on the leather satchel barely visible beneath her worn coat. "Well now," he drawled, whiskey heavy on his breath. "Seems the late Mr. Edison's widow needs some assistance. Heard tell your departed husband left behind some interesting papers." Martha's hands stilled on the flour sack. Her husband Thomas had been dead 3 months, taken by fever. But somehow these men knew about the documents she'd never dared to read. The second rider circled behind her, cutting off any escape route. "Mr. Carnegie sends his regards. Says those papers belong to him, seeing as how your husband worked his ledgers." A rifle shot cracked through the air. The leader's hat flew off as he stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. From the ridge came a rider, black hair streaming like a war banner, his mount moving with the fluid grace of prairie wind. The horseman swept down upon them, using his rifle stock like a club, sending the second man sprawling into the dirt. "The lady said nothing about wanting your company," the newcomer said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being heard. He wore a mixture of traditional Lakota dress and settler clothing, his presence commanding despite his calm demeanor. "I am Samuel Sitting Bull. These are my hunting grounds." The wounded men scrambled for their horses, the leader snarling threats about Carnegie's retribution. Samuel watched them flee with the patient stillness of a hawk, his rifle never wavering until they disappeared over the horizon. Martha found herself studying her rescuer in the dying light. His face bore the weathered lines of someone who had seen both beauty and brutality in equal measure. When he dismounted to examine her broken axle, she noticed how he moved with economical precision, wasting nothing. "Thank you," she managed, her voice steadier than her hands. "Though I fear they'll return." Samuel nodded, already assessing the damage to her wagon. "Carnegie's men are like coyotes. They hunt in packs and prey on the isolated." He looked up at her, his dark eyes serious. "You cannot stay here tonight." Together, they managed to secure the remaining flour sacks and fashion a temporary repair to the axle. As they worked, Martha noticed how his hands, scarred from years of survival, moved with surprising gentleness when handling her goods. "I can get you to Ridge Creek by morning," he said. "But you should know those men spoke truth about one thing. Whatever papers your husband left, Carnegie will not stop until he has them." Martha's hand unconsciously moved to the satchel beneath her coat. She'd carried it for 3 months without looking inside, afraid of what truths it might contain about Thomas's work at the mining company. "I run the bread oven behind May Sullivan's boarding house. It's not much, but it's honest work." Samuel studied her for a long moment. "My daughter has been ill. The agency doctor says she needs proper bread, not the hardtack they distribute. She's recovered from the fever, but remains weak." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I could hire you to bake for her, real bread with proper flour." Martha considered the unexpected offer. A Lakota warrior hiring a white widow to bake bread would set every tongue in Ridge Creek wagging. But something in his eyes, a father's worry mixed with stubborn pride, made her nod. "Come by the oven house tomorrow morning. I'll have fresh bread ready." As they prepared to leave, Samuel added quietly, "Those papers, hide them well. Carnegie owns more than mines. He owns men's souls in that town. The sheriff, the judge, even some of the shopkeepers danced to his tune." The night deepened around them, stars emerging like scattered flour across the darkening sky. Martha climbed onto the repaired wagon, acutely aware of how the leather satchel pressed against her ribs. Whatever Thomas had documented in those pages had already cost one life. She prayed it wouldn't cost more. The next morning found Martha's earthen oven glowing red in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd built it herself behind the boarding house stable, a small dome of clay and stone that held heat like cupped hands. The sourdough starter. Carried all the way from Ohio in her mother's ceramic crock, bubbled with life as she worked it into the flour. Samuel arrived as the first loaves emerged, the smell of fresh bread cutting through the morning chill. Beside him rode a small girl, perhaps 8 years old, with enormous dark eyes and blue glass beads woven into her braided hair. She sat her pony with the natural grace of one born to the saddle, though Martha could see the lingering effects of illness in her thin frame. "This is Elizabeth Standing Bear," Samuel said, helping his daughter dismount. "Elizabeth, this is Mrs. Edison. She makes the bread I told you about." Martha crouched to the child's eye level, breaking off a piece of warm bread. "It's still hot from the oven. Careful now." She watched as Elizabeth took a tentative bite, then saw the girl's eyes widen with pleasure. "It breathes," Elizabeth whispered, touching the soft interior. "Like it's alive." "That's the starter," Martha explained, charmed by the child's wonder. "My mother taught me that good bread is indeed alive. Would you like to see?" As she showed Elizabeth how to shape dough, Martha became aware of the stares from passing townspeople, a white woman teaching a Lakota child. It was enough to set every gossip in Ridge Creek ablaze, from the saloon across the way. She spotted 2 of Carnegie's men watching with predatory interest. Samuel noticed them too. He placed dried venison and prairie turnips on her work table as payment, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "We'll return tomorrow," he said formally, but his eyes conveyed a warning, be careful. Word spread through the settlement like wildfire. Some whispered it with scandalized delight. That Lakota warrior hired the widow Edison to bake bread for his half-breed daughter. Others twisted it into something more sinister, adding salacious details with each retelling. Martha heard one version from May Sullivan herself, who delivered it with a mixture of amusement and concern. "They're saying all sorts of nonsense," May reported, settling her substantial frame onto a flour barrel. "But I told them straight, anyone who pays fair and treats folks decent is welcome at my establishment." That evening, as Martha banked the coals in her oven, she finally opened Thomas's satchel. Inside, she found notebooks filled with his careful script columns of numbers, shipment records, and names. Her heart sank as she began to understand. Thomas had been documenting the systematic theft of gold from the miners, skimmed off through false weights and doctored ledgers. Carnegie's name appeared again and again, along with a web of conspirators that reached from the assay office to the territorial courthouse. The last entry, dated just days before Thomas's death, was a single line, "They know I know." Martha's hands trembled as she wrapped the documents in oilcloth and hid them beneath a loose stone in the oven's foundation. The mild-mannered clerk she'd married had been gathering evidence of a conspiracy that could bring down some of the most powerful men in the territory. And now that burden had passed to her. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the stable doors and sending tumbleweeds dancing like restless spirits across the empty street. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, and Martha couldn't shake the feeling that Ridge Creek itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was surely coming. Martha Edison's past unfolded in her mind like pages from a worn diary. She had left Ohio at 17, following Thomas westward with nothing but hope and her mother's sourdough starter in a ceramic crock. Their 3 years together had been modest but content until the fever took him, leaving her with a failing homestead, a small clay oven, and a leather satchel she'd been too afraid to open. She'd learned to survive on the margins, firing her oven in bitter wind, stretching precious flour, trading bread for hay. The pitying looks from townswomen stung less than the predatory glances from men who saw a widow as easy prey. Martha had grown a shell as hard as her oven's exterior, as necessary for survival as water in this unforgiving land. Samuel Sitting Bull's story emerged in fragments during their morning exchanges. Once a cavalry scout for the army, he'd chosen to live on the settlement's edge to keep Elizabeth near Doc Harrison, the only physician who'd treat Lakota children. In his silence, Martha recognized a kindred grief, the weight of raising a child alone in a world that offered few mercies. Elizabeth's recovery progressed slowly after her winter fever. She ate poorly and coughed through the night. The child possessed a quick mind but spoke little, her curiosity emerging through clever hands that shaped dough as if reading its secrets. Martha found herself looking forward to these morning lessons, where the only language that mattered was flour, water, and patient instruction. Meanwhile, Silas Carnegie ruled Ridge Creek from his office above the Grand Hotel. The Scotsman had arrived 5 years prior with Eastern money and Western ambitions. He controlled the ore wagons, owned shares in 3 mines, and fixed the price of everything from flour to coffins. His lieutenants, men like the brutal Benjamin Bull Morgan, collected debts with fists when ledgers failed to persuade. Martha discovered her husband's meticulous records painted a damning picture. Thomas had tracked gold shipments diverted from their rightful destinations, ore weights falsified at the scales, and payments that vanished between mine and bank. The conspiracy reached Deep Judge Franklin Pierce, Sheriff John Garfield, even the mild-mannered assayer William McKinley. All appeared in Thomas's careful notations. Her husband had been more than a clerk. He'd been a witness, federal investigators. The notes suggested had recruited him to document the systematic theft that was bleeding the territory dry, but they'd underestimated Carnegie's reach. Thomas's fever now seemed less like God's will and more like man's design. Martha's internal struggle intensified nightly. Fear whispered for her to burn the papers and flee, but anger at Thomas's death, at Carnegie's stranglehold on the town, at a system that crushed the powerless, burned hotter than fear. And increasingly, she thought of Samuel and Elizabeth, of all the families ground down by Carnegie's machine. Samuel's conflict ran deeper than simple geography. He stood between 2 worlds: his people, pushed onto reservations and agency rations, and the white settlement that simultaneously needed and despised them. He'd hoped education and adaptation might buy Elizabeth a future, but watching his daughter recover from an illness that better food might have prevented, he questioned every compromise he'd made. Each person carried absence like a stone. Martha missed Thomas's gentle presence, his ink-stained fingers, his quiet conviction that truth mattered. Samuel mourned his wife, Clara, taken by the same fever that nearly claimed Elizabeth, another casualty of inadequate supplies and broken treaty promises. Elizabeth, young as she was, felt the void of a mother she barely remembered and a world that seemed determined to erase her existence. The land itself seemed to echo their losses. Drought had cracked the earth like broken promises. At night, wolves howled from distant ridges, their voices carrying all the loneliness of the vast territory. Dust storms rose without warning, scouring skin and soul alike, while the mines gaped like wounds that would never heal. Daily survival required small rituals of persistence. Martha rose before dawn to heat her oven, coaxing life from banked coals. She rationed flour with mathematical precision, transformed prairie turnips into something palatable, patched her worn dress until hardly any original fabric remained. Samuel mended harnesses, hunted when game allowed, and navigated the treacherous politics of staying native in a white town. Elizabeth practiced her letters in flour dust, learned to braid sweetgrass into her hair, and slowly began to smile again. The settlement itself teetered between civilization and chaos. Ridge Creek boasted a church, a school, and pretensions of Eastern refinement, but beneath the veneer lay a harder truth: justice belonged to whoever could afford it. Law bent before money like grass before wind. And the gap between Carnegie's Grand Hotel and the tent city where miners' families lived might as well have been an ocean. The noon sun cast sharp shadows across the dusty street as Elizabeth learned her letters by sprinkling flour in careful lines on Martha's work table. Her small fingers traced each character with intense concentration, transforming the simple ingredient into a doorway to literacy. Samuel watched from the doorway, using his knife to carve delicate patterns into the handle of a bread paddle, a quiet gift of gratitude that spoke louder than words. "E for Elizabeth," the child announced proudly, then added with a shy smile, "E for Edison, too." Martha felt her heart constrict at the simple observation. In just 2 weeks, this resilient child had worked her way past Martha's carefully maintained defenses. "That's right, clever girl. Now let's try your name in full." The Swedish blacksmith, Lars Nansen, became their first ally, a bear of a man with hands scarred from years at the forge. He appeared one morning offering to trade fresh horseshoe nails for bread. But his eyes held a deeper message. He too had lost someone to Carnegie's accidents at the mine. As he worked, reshaping Martha's broken wagon reinforcements, he spoke in low tones about other families nursing similar grief. Reverend George Washington Williams, the Baptist minister whose small church served the black railroad workers and miners, proved another unexpected supporter. He arrived seeking communion bread but stayed to discuss justice, offering his church as a safe meeting place for those Carnegie had wronged. May Sullivan, the boarding house proprietor whose Irish temper was legendary, began deflecting the curious and warning Martha when Carnegie's men lingered too long near the oven. The first flour shipment to arrive under Carnegie's new monopoly revealed his strategy. Prices had doubled overnight, and credit was extended only to those who signed contracts binding them to his company's store. Martha watched families count their coins with desperation, calculating how many meals they could squeeze from a single bag. "We could go hunting more," Samuel suggested one afternoon, watching Elizabeth share her bread with a miner's hungry child. "Prairie chickens, rabbit, trade for flour from the agency stores." Martha shook her head. "The agency flour is half sawdust. I've seen it. Elizabeth needs real food." She paused, then added quietly, "They all do." Their first trip together across the salt flats to supply the outlying mining camps proved pivotal. Martha learned to wrap bread in damp hide to preserve moisture, while Samuel taught her to read the sky for incoming sandstorms. Elizabeth rode between them, chattering about the shapes she saw in clouds, her health visibly improving with each passing day. During a rest stop in the lee of red rocks, Elizabeth's mood suddenly shifted. "I saw the fire," she said quietly, her usual brightness dimming. At the mine, before the thunder sound, Martha and Samuel exchanged glances. The child was speaking of the accident that had killed 12 miners the previous month. The same incident Thomas's notes had labeled as deliberate sabotage to destroy evidence of withheld wages. "There were men arguing," Elizabeth continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one in the tall hat was angry. He gave papers to the man who watches the cave mouth. Then came the fire sound, and the mountain cried." Samuel's jaw tightened. The man in the tall hat could only be Carnegie himself. His daughter had witnessed the prelude to murder. That evening, by their small campfire, Martha told Elizabeth stories of sourdough starter passed down through generations, how it carried the memory of all the bread that came before. Samuel contributed tales of stars that guided warriors home and horses that could smell water miles away. Two cultural traditions wove together naturally in the firelight, creating something new and resilient. Back in Ridge Creek, the situation deteriorated. Young miners, many of them Irish immigrants or freed slaves, spoke in hushed tones about wage cuts and dangerous conditions. The Chinese workers who laid track for the spur line reported similar exploitation, paid in company scrip worthless outside Carnegie's stores. Martha began to notice a pattern. Those who complained publicly often suffered accidents, a support beam failing here, a charge detonating early there. The message was clear silence or cemetery. One evening, as Martha cleaned her work table, Elizabeth presented her with a gift, a small corn husk doll wearing a dress made from flour sacking. Her name is Hope. The child announced, "She helps make the bread rise." The simple toy, tucked carefully beside Martha's sourdough crock, became a talisman of sorts. It reminded her that she was fighting for more than justice for Thomas. She was fighting for Elizabeth's future, for all the children growing up in Carnegie's shadow. Samuel began spending more time at the oven, ostensibly checking on Elizabeth's progress, but increasingly drawn into conversation with Martha. They discovered shared values beneath their surface differences: belief in hard work, fair dealing, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Neither acknowledged the deeper connection growing between them, but May Sullivan noticed, commenting with her usual directness. "That warrior looks at you like you hung the moon," she observed, helping Martha stack fresh loaves. "And you light up like Christmas morning when his horse comes around the corner." Martha flushed but didn't deny it. "It's not that simple. May, you know what people would say." "People say plenty already," May retorted. "Might as well give them something true to gossip about." The revelation came when Elizabeth brought Martha a scrap of paper she'd been using to practice letters. A blood-stained corner torn from a ledger. Though faded, the entries were clear gold shipments diverted, weights falsified, payments disappeared. More damning still was half a signature S. Carn. The child had unknowingly preserved evidence from the mine explosion, a fragment that corroborated everything in Thomas's hidden documents. Deputy Harrison Ford arrived at Martha's oven house leading 3 armed men, his tin star catching the morning light like a false promise. Carnegie's enforcer. He wielded a freshly printed transport permit with the territorial seal, demanding to inspect all goods and lodgings for contraband materials affecting mine operations. Martha stood her ground as Ford's men pawed through her flour stores and overturned grain sacks. May Sullivan materialized from the boarding house. Reverend Williams emerged from his church, and Lars Nansen set down his hammer to join the growing crowd of silent witnesses. Their presence formed a protective wall that even Ford couldn't ignore. "Nothing but flour and an honest woman's livelihood here," May announced loudly, her voice carrying across the street. "Unless Carnegie's afraid of bread now." Ford leaned close to Martha, tobacco breath hot against her cheek. "Your husband thought he was clever too. Hand over his papers, and you can keep baking your bread in peace. Otherwise, this territory gets mighty dangerous after dark." That night, Martha couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The boarding house stable caught fire near midnight. Samuel and Martha managed to douse the flames before they reached the oven. But the message was clear. Elizabeth had been staying with May during the incident, and Martha thanked God for that small mercy. News of the mine accident from the previous month emerged in fragments. The victims' widows, led by Mary Todd, a fierce woman who'd lost her husband in the blast, gathered at Reverend Williams's church. They spoke of deliberately weakened support beams, of their husbands' complaints about unsafe conditions ignored, of the mine supervisor Abraham Brooks accepting envelopes from Carnegie the day before the explosion. Martha shared what she dared, not the documents themselves, but confirmation that evidence existed. "Justice will come," she promised, though she wondered if she believed it herself. "But we must be patient and careful." Samuel's revelation came during a quiet moment as they repaired the fire-damaged stable wall. "I wasn't just an Army scout," he said, his voice low. "I worked with federal investigators before, tracking illegal weapons sales to reservations. I know their procedures, their codes." He paused, fitting a board into place. "I also know Carnegie has judges and lawmen in his pocket from here to Denver." The confession explained his careful observations, his strategic thinking. It also revealed the burden he carried, caught between his people's traditional ways and the white man's law, trusted fully by neither. A dust storm rolled in 3 days later, turning the sky yellow-brown and driving everyone indoors. Under cover of the whirling sand, Ford's men struck again. They cornered Elizabeth near the cemetery where she'd been placing wildflowers on her mother's grave. The child darted between headstones like a rabbit evading hawks, finally squeezing through a gap in the iron fence too narrow for grown men to follow. She ran home with skinned knees and terror in her eyes. clutching the corn-husked doll Martha had given her. Samuel's rage was cold and controlled. "They've crossed a line," he said, checking his rifle with methodical precision. But Martha caught his arm. "That's what they want, an excuse to call you a savage, to justify whatever comes next." She held Elizabeth close, feeling the child's racing heartbeat. "We need to be smarter than they are." The community's fear began transforming into something else: quiet resistance. Miners' wives stopped shopping at Carnegie's store, walking miles to trade with native suppliers instead. The Chinese railway workers shared information through their own networks, mapping Carnegie's shipments and guard rotations. Even some of Carnegie's own men, those with families and consciences, began to question their employers' methods. Trust solidified through small acts. Samuel taught Martha to read weather signs and track movement in dust. Martha showed Samuel how to interpret the coded messages in Thomas's journals, the accounting shortcuts that revealed falsified records. They worked by lamplight after Elizabeth slept, their partnership deepening with each shared discovery. The child's recovery was remarkable. Color returned to her cheeks, and her laughter rang out more frequently. She absorbed languages like spring earth absorbs rain, switching between English and Lakota with ease, even picking up phrases of Cantonese from the railway workers' children she played with. One evening, as Martha tucked Elizabeth into the small bed they'd made in the back room of the bakery, the child asked, "Will you be my mother now?" Martha's throat constricted. Elizabeth, that's something your father and I would need to discuss. He wants you to be," Elizabeth said with a child's devastating directness. "He looks at you the way he used to look at Mama before the sadness came." The culmination arrived when Theodore Roosevelt Custer, a territorial inspector known for his incorruptibility, announced an unexpected visit to Ridge Creek. Carnegie's network buzzed with activity. Ledgers were altered, witnesses pressured, evidence destroyed. The smoke from burning documents darkened the sky over the Grand Hotel. But Martha had anticipated this. With Samuel's help, she'd made copies of the most damning evidence, distributing them among trusted allies. Reverend Williams hid some in his church's cornerstone. Lars Nansen concealed others in his forge, and May Sullivan sewed documents into her corset lining. The night before Custer's arrival, Carnegie made his move. Elizabeth was taken while fetching water from the well, a calculated strike designed to break Martha and Samuel's resolve. The ransom demand was simple: all documents in exchange for the child. Martha stared at the note, her hands trembling. Everything she'd worked for, all hope of justice for Thomas and the others, weighed against Elizabeth's life. The choice that wasn't a choice at all. "We don't negotiate with devils," Samuel said, but his voice cracked. The warrior who'd faced death without flinching was undone by his daughter's danger. As darkness fell over Ridge Creek, Martha made her decision. "We'll give him what he wants," she said. Then, meeting Samuel's eyes, she added, "But not the way he expects." The morning after Elizabeth's abduction, Martha stood before her cold oven, unable to summon the will to light it. The empty bakery echoed with the child's absence. Her flower letters still dusted the table. Her small apron hung on its peg. The corn-husk doll waited patiently by the sourdough crock. Carnegie's blockade was swift and merciless. The general store, under pressure, refused to sell Martha flour or yeast. The wells suddenly required permits to draw water. Even firewood became scarce as suppliers were warned against dealing with troublemakers. Martha's hands trembled as she counted her remaining coins. Without income from bread sales, without access to supplies, she faced a choice between starvation and submission. The leather satchel hidden beneath the oven's foundation seemed to pulse with terrible weight. Samuel's inner torment was written in every line of his body. The warrior who had faced cavalry charges and survived winter campaigns was being destroyed by helplessness. "I should have sent her away," he said hoarsely, staring at the empty horizon. "To my sister's people in the Northern Territories. She would have been safe. She would have been miserable. Martha replied firmly. Elizabeth loves this place. These people, she loves you. The unspoken words, and me, hung between them like morning mist. Old rage warred with new fear in Samuel's heart. The injustices against his people, the broken treaties and stolen lands, had taught him that white man's law was a flexible thing, bent always toward power. Yet he'd tried to work within it, for Elizabeth's sake. Now that same system held his daughter hostage. Martha faced her own reckoning. The timid Ohio girl who'd followed her husband west was gone, replaced by someone harder and fiercer. She thought of Thomas's gentle faith in justice, his belief that truth properly documented could overcome evil. But truth seemed fragile as frost against Carnegie's machinery of greed. Deputy Ford arrived at dusk with a final offer. His men formed a semicircle around the bakery, hands resting on gun handles. Mr. Carnegie is generous, Ford announced. The documents tonight, and the girl goes free. Refuse, and she'll be sent to the industrial school for wayward children in Chicago. For her own good, of course. Half-breeds need proper civilizing. The threat hit its mark. Those schools were graves for native children's spirits, places where they were beaten for speaking their language, where their hair was shorn and their name stolen. Elizabeth would survive, but she would return a stranger. That night, Ridge Creek witnessed something unprecedented. One by one, figures emerged from shadows, miners' wives with rolling pins, Chinese workers with sledgehammers, freed slaves with picks from the railroad camp. They gathered silently around Martha's bakery, forming a human shield. You'll have to go through all of us, May Sullivan declared, her usually jovial face stern as granite. Reverend William stepped forward, his Bible in one hand. I've already sent word to newspapers in Denver and St. Louis about what's happening here. The whole territory will be watching. Ford retreated, but everyone knew it was temporary. Carnegie had too much at stake to be deterred by a crowd of common folk. In the dark hours before dawn, Martha made her decision. She retrieved Thomas's documents and laid them on her table beside Elizabeth's flower letters. We give him what he wants, she told Samuel. But first, we make sure everyone sees it. Samuel studied her face in the lamplight. You have a plan. Lars can forge Carnegie's signature. He's done decorative metal work that requires a steady hand. We create new documents, ones that implicate Carnegie in worse crimes. When he presents them as evidence that we were lying, the real investigators will look closer. It was dangerous beyond measure, but Samuel saw the steel in her spine and nodded. What do you need? Throughout the night, their unlikely alliance worked. Lars Nansen practiced Carnegie's signature from the fragment Elizabeth had found. Reverend Williams contributed paper with the proper watermarks, borrowed from the courthouse. May Sullivan recalled overheard conversations, adding authentic details to their fabrications. The false documents were masterful records of Carnegie ordering the mine explosion, bribing federal inspectors, even selling weapons to hostile tribes. Mixed with enough truth to be plausible, they painted Carnegie as a traitor as well as a thief. Dawn brought revelation. Martha discovered Elizabeth's doll was missing. The child must have taken it when grabbed. Inside the doll, Martha had hidden a single page of Thomas's real evidence, thinking it mere sentiment. Now that page was with Elizabeth, wherever Carnegie held her. She's clever, that one, Samuel said, pride mixing with anguish. She knows something's hidden there. She's trying to help. Word came through Lars's nephew, who worked at the Grand Hotel. Elizabeth was being held in the abandoned smelter at Red Butte Canyon. The place was a fortress of rusted iron and slag heaps, approachable only through a narrow gorge. 20 men guard it, the boy reported. But the little girl, she sings sometimes, Lakota songs, so they know she's alive. Martha closed her eyes, hearing Elizabeth's voice in memory. Then she opened them, resolved. Tonight, we get her back, one way or another. Samuel gripped her shoulder. Together. Together. The plan required precise timing. While Carnegie waited at the bakery for Martha to deliver the documents, Samuel would create a diversion at the smelter. The real challenge was ensuring Elizabeth's safety in the chaos that would follow. As sunset approached, Martha prepared for what might be her last night on Earth. She banked the oven's coals carefully, fed her sourdough starter, and left instructions for May. If she didn't return, the recipes and the mother dough would pass to other hands, other women who needed honest work. She looked at Samuel, memorizing his face. "If something happens—" "Nothing will happen," he interrupted. "We'll bring her home, all of us." But they both knew the odds. Carnegie had wealth, men, and the law twisted to his purpose. They had only courage, community, and a child's songbird voice calling them forward into the gathering dark. Samuel tracked the horseshoe prints through sage and gravel toward Red Butte Canyon, reading the story written in disturbed earth. 3 wagons, heavily loaded, 8 riders. The abandoned smelter rose from the canyon floor like a rusted cathedral, its skeletal framework groaning in the wind that whistled through corroded pipes. Martha carried her satchel of documents, both real and forged, along with coils of sturdy rope, a lantern, and a bundle of blasting caps Lars had provided. Her deceased husband's notes about controlled demolition echoed in her mind. Thomas had written about bringing down unstable mine shafts without endangering workers. Tonight, that knowledge might save Elizabeth. The smelter sprawled across the canyon bottom, a maze of slag heaps and processing ruins. Sulfur still clung to the air from years of ore processing, mixing with the newer scents of horse and campfire. Through the skeletal towers, lamplight flickered where Carnegie's men had made their stronghold. They planned their approach like a mountain storm, sudden, overwhelming, strategic, using small charges to destabilize slag piles rather than harm anyone. They would create chaos and confusion. The narrow canyon would amplify sound, making a few explosions seem like an army's assault. The first blast erupted near the eastern slag heap, sending a cascade of black debris down the slope. Guards shouted, horses whinnied, and men scrambled for positions. In the confusion, Martha slipped through the rusted framework, following the thin sound of Elizabeth singing. Carnegie emerged from the main building, his usually immaculate suit dusty with neglect. "Show yourselves," he roared. "I know it's you, Edison woman." Samuel's rifle cracked from the ridge, the bullet striking a metal beam near Carnegie's head. Not to kill, they needed him alive, but to keep him moving, distracted. Martha found Elizabeth in what had been the foreman's office, tied but unharmed, clutching her corn-husked doll. The child's eyes widened with relief. "Mother Martha, I knew you'd come." "Shh, brave girl." Martha cut the ropes with shaking hands. "We need to move quickly." But Deputy Ford blocked their exit, revolver drawn. "Going somewhere, ladies." Samuel materialized behind him like smoke, bringing his rifle stock down hard. Ford crumpled, and they stepped over his unconscious form. The 3 of them moved through the maze of machinery, Elizabeth clinging to both adults' hands. Carnegie intercepted them in the main yard, his own pistol steady despite the chaos. "The documents, Mrs. Edison, now." Martha held out the satchel with one hand while her other found the final blasting cap in her pocket. "Take them, but know this, copies exist. Inspector Custer will receive them whether you stop us or not." "You're bluffing." But uncertainty flickered in Carnegie's eyes. "Am I your signature on orders to eliminate problematic workers? Your personal seal on diverted gold shipments? Even if they're forgeries, as you'll claim, investigators will dig deeper. They'll find the truth beneath." Carnegie lunged for the satchel. Samuel moved to intercept, and the 2 men grappled in the dust. Carnegie was larger, but Samuel fought with a father's desperation. They rolled dangerously close to an unstable slag wall. Ford, bloodied but conscious, crawled toward his dropped gun. Elizabeth, with a child's pure instinct, kicked it into a drainage gully. The deputy's curse was lost in another explosion as Martha's final charge brought down a section of wooden scaffolding, blocking reinforcements. "The territorial inspector approaches," someone shouted. "Cavalry on the ridge." Carnegie's rage transformed to calculation. He still held influence. Judges who owed him favors, but federal investigation meant scrutiny he couldn't afford. His grip on Samuel loosened. "This isn't over," he snarled, backing toward his horse. Samuel let him go, turning instead to embrace his daughter. Martha lit the prepared fuse on the slag pile behind Carnegie, not to harm, but to emphasize her point. The explosion sent cascades of industrial waste sliding across Carnegie's escape route, forcing him to abandon dignity and scramble over sharp debris. More riders appeared, not cavalry, but Reverend Williams leading townspeople. They'd followed, ready to bear witness. May Sullivan rode at the front, her boarding house shotgun across her saddle. "Thought you might need help," she called. "Besides, I wasn't missing the show." Carnegie and his remaining men retreated into the canyon darkness, leaving behind the smelter and their pretense of lawful authority. They'd return to lawyers and schemes, but their reign of open terror was broken. Martha knelt beside Elizabeth, checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" "No." Elizabeth held up her doll, slightly worse for wear. "I kept her safe. The paper inside, too." Samuel lifted his daughter, his warrior's composure finally cracking. Tears marked trails through the dust on his face. "My brave little fox, you remembered." The ride back to Ridge Creek was subdued. Elizabeth dozed between Samuel and Martha, her small hands gripping both their sleeves. Behind them, the smelter ruin smoldered like a dying beast, marking the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Martha thought of the documents now in Carnegie's hands, some real, some forged, all dangerous. She'd gambled everything on his arrogance, betting he'd present the fabrications as proof of her deception. When federal investigators discovered the forgeries, they'd look closer at what was real. "You gave him Thomas's evidence," Samuel said quietly. "Some of it, enough to hang himself if he's foolish enough to use it." She touched the hidden pocket in her skirt. "The most damning pieces are still safe. Letters in his own hand, bank drafts, things he doesn't know Thomas collected." Samuel nodded slowly. "A warrior's strategy. Let the enemy's weapon become his weakness." As they crested the final ridge, Ridge Creek's lights spread below them like fallen stars. The bakery's chimney stood dark, but waiting. Tomorrow would bring new battles, legal ones, fought with testimony and evidence rather than gunpowder. But tonight, Elizabeth was safe, and that was victory enough. "Will you stay?" Martha asked suddenly. "Both of you, not just for bread anymore, but—" Samuel's hand found hers across Elizabeth's sleeping form. "Where else would we go? This is home now. You made it so." Behind them, the smelter's fires died to ember glow. Ahead, the town stirred with anticipation of change, and between past and future, three souls who'd found each other in loss rode together toward whatever dawn might bring. Federal Marshal Theodore Roosevelt arrived in Ridge Creek 3 days later, leading a detail of cavalry that raised dust clouds visible for miles. Unlike the theatrical Inspector Custer everyone expected, Roosevelt was a compact man with steel-rimmed spectacles and an intensity that made grown men step backward. His reputation preceded him, incorruptible, methodical, and utterly unimpressed by wealth or threats. Martha provided her testimony in the back room of Reverend Williams's church. Away from prying eyes, she laid out Thomas's evidence piece by piece, ledgers showing falsified weights, receipts for gold that never reached its destination, and most damning, Carnegie's own correspondence discussing the elimination of problems. "Your husband was a brave man, Mrs. Edison," Roosevelt said, studying the documents through his spectacles. "He knew the risks of gathering this information." Elizabeth, sitting quietly beside her father, suddenly spoke up. "I saw the bad man give papers before the mountain cried." She described what she'd witnessed before the mine explosion with a child's clarity that cut through adult equivocation. Roosevelt took her testimony as seriously as any adult's, making careful notes. Samuel watched the marshal with guarded hope. He'd seen too many promises of justice evaporate like morning dew. The arrests began at dawn. Carnegie, confident in his purchased influence, was taken from the Grand Hotel in irons. Judge Franklin Pierce, Sheriff John Garfield, and 6 other officials found themselves facing federal charges. The territorial courthouse, Long Carnegie's stronghold, became the stage for his downfall. But Carnegie had resources for one last gambit. His lawyers presented the forged documents Martha had allowed him to take, claiming they proved a conspiracy to frame an innocent businessman. The forgeries were excellent, but Roosevelt's investigators found the flaws Lars had carefully embedded. Impossible dates, references to places that didn't exist, signatures that didn't quite match. The revelation that some documents were forged nearly derailed everything until Martha played her final card. She produced the originals Thomas had hidden, documents she'd kept back, knowing Carnegie would try to discredit her, side by side. The real and fake evidence told its own story. Carnegie had incriminated himself by presenting forgeries that too closely matched crimes he'd actually committed. During the trial, Ridge Creek transformed. Miners who'd been silent for years found their voices. Mary Todd led a group of widows to testify about their husbands' deaths. The Chinese workers, through an interpreter, revealed the systematic wage theft they'd endured. Even some of Carnegie's former employees, seeing which way the wind blew, offered evidence in exchange for leniency. Deputy Ford broke under questioning, admitting to everything from arson to attempted kidnapping. His testimony sealed Carnegie's fate, though Ford himself would serve significant time in federal prison. The verdict came on a crystalline morning, guilty on all charges. Carnegie's empire crumbled within hours. The mines would be placed under federal oversight until honest operators could be found. Stolen wages would be repaid from Carnegie's seized assets. For the first time in years, justice wore a badge in Ridge Creek. After the trial, Reverend Williams held a memorial service on the hill overlooking town. He read the names of every miner who died under suspicious circumstances, every family destroyed by greed. Martha stood with Samuel and Elizabeth, watching eagles circle in the thermal currents above. Thomas would be proud. May Sullivan said, joining them, "You finished what he started." Martha touched the leather satchel one last time before burning it that evening. The documents had served their purpose. She wanted no more reminders of that dark chapter. Change came gradually but steadily. Lars Nansen received a contract to repair mining equipment, ensuring safer working conditions. The Chinese workers organized their own mutual aid society with legal recognition. Reverend Williams's church became a meeting place for all of Ridge Creek's communities, breaking down barriers that Carnegie had exploited. Martha wrote to her mother in Ohio, a letter she'd been composing in her heart for months. "Dearest Mother, I write with news I never thought to share. The man who killed Thomas has been brought to justice. But more than that, I've found a new family in the most unexpected way. A Lakota warrior and his daughter have become as dear to me as life itself. I know this isn't the path you imagined for me, but it's one that leads to happiness. Your granddaughter Elizabeth, for that's how I think of her now, has your gift for seeing truth in simple things. The sourdough starter you gave me continues to rise, feeding a new generation. I am, at last, home." Samuel's proposal came without fanfare, as was his way. He simply appeared one morning with 2 horses and a question. "Elizabeth needs a mother. I need a partner. But more than that, I need you. Will you marry us?" Martha's answer required no words. She kissed him there in the doorway of her bakery, flour still dusting her hands, while Elizabeth cheered and May Sullivan wiped away tears she'd deny later. The wedding was planned for autumn, allowing time for Samuel's sister to travel from the Northern Territories. It would blend traditions, Lakota ceremonies on the prairie, Christian vows in Williams Church, The entire town would celebrate the union that had begun with bread and courage. Elizabeth flourished in the newfound peace, her health fully restored. She ran with the other children, mixing languages and laughter. She kept her corn husk doll on a shelf of honor, sometimes whispering stories to it about the night everyone was brave. Martha resumed her baking with new purpose. The bakery became a gathering place where former enemies shared tables. She taught other women her trade, ensuring no family would depend solely on mine wages. The sourdough starter, now legendary for its resilience, was divided and shared, spreading Martha's legacy throughout the territory. Samuel found work training horses for the reformed mining operation, his skills valued fairly for the first time. He also served as liaison between the Lakota and the town, building bridges that should have existed from the beginning. On quiet evenings, the three of them would sit outside the bakery, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Elizabeth would practice her letters in the dust, while Martha and Samuel planned their future. Perhaps a larger bakery, maybe even a school where all children could learn together. The West was still wild, still dangerous in its way, but in Ridge Creek, at least, justice had prevailed over greed. Love had conquered prejudice, and a new family had risen from the ashes of loss like bread from patient hands and honest hearts. The first winter as a family arrived with gentle snowfall that blanketed Ridge Creek in pristine white. The bakery stable had been expanded into a proper shop. Edison and Sitting Bull Bread House, with a small apartment above where Martha, Samuel, and Elizabeth made their home. The earthen oven, reinforced with new stones from the canyon, glowed warmly through the coldest days. Martha taught Elizabeth and 9 other children miners' daughters, Lakota boys, Chinese merchant sons, to read using flour letters and bread dough. The classroom smelled of yeast and possibility. Samuel built child-sized furniture and carved teaching aids, finding unexpected joy in creating rather than fighting. A wagon train of widows arrived from Missouri. Seeking new lives away from war-torn regions, Martha divided her work, teaching them the baker's trade and helping them establish their own ovens. Within months, Ridge Creek boasted 4 bakeries, each with its own specialty, none competing but rather complementing each other. News arrived from the federal courthouse in Denver. Carnegie's appeals had failed. His fortune was distributed among his victims' families. The mining families who'd lost fathers and husbands received compensation that, while never replacing their loved ones, at least secured their futures. Mary Todd used her settlement to open a boarding school for miners' children. One crystalline morning, a delegation of Lakota elders arrived, led by Samuel's mother, Victoria Standing Bear. She studied Martha with keen eyes before presenting a buffalo hide blanket woven with wave patterns, the mark of acceptance into the family. Martha reciprocated by offering her sourdough starter in her own mother's crock, explaining through Samuel's translation how it had been passed down through generations. 2 rivers joining, Victoria observed, watching Elizabeth knead dough with practiced hands, making something stronger than either alone. The spring brought unexpected growth. The territorial government, impressed by Ridge Creek's transformation, designated it as a model for peaceful integration. Delegations arrived to study how former enemies now shared meals and commerce. Martha found herself explaining, again and again, that it had started with simple acts feeding a sick child, standing together against injustice, choosing trust over fear. Elizabeth blossomed into a natural bridge between communities. At 10, she spoke 3 languages fluently and served as interpreter for important meetings. She kept her corn husk doll on a shelf in the bakery, sometimes showing it to younger children while telling the story of the night courage defeated greed. "Remember," she'd say solemnly, "even small people can be brave. Even scared people can do right." The bread and horses establishment became more than a bakery. It was a trading post, meeting hall, and symbol of the new Ridge Creek. Samuel bred and trained horses in the expanded stable area, teaching both Lakota and settler youth the ancient arts of horsemanship. Martha's breds fed not just bodies, but community bonds. Theodore Roosevelt returned for a brief visit, bringing news that the Ridge Creek story had reached Washington. "You've proven something important here," he told Martha and Samuel, "that justice and reconciliation are possible, even in the wildest places." A letter arrived from Ohio. Martha's mother had passed peacefully, but not before adding a codicil to her will. She left her entire recipe collection and a small inheritance to my daughter Martha and her chosen family, proof that love knows no boundaries. The summer solstice brought the dedication of a new community building, made from local stone and timber. It served all faiths and purposes. Reverend Williams blessed it alongside a Lakota spiritual leader and a Buddhist monk from the Chinese community. Above the door, Lars had forged words suggested by Elizabeth: "Justice is bread, it must be kneaded, risen and baked, none shall go hungry." One evening, as purple shadows stretched across the valley, a familiar figure appeared at the bakery door. Thomas Edison, Martha's brother-in-law, whom she'd never met. The inventor had heard of his brother's widow's remarkable story and came bearing gifts, a mechanical dough mixer of his own design, and a proposal to document their story for his new moving picture camera. "Thomas would be amazed," he said simply, watching Elizabeth demonstrate bread-making for his camera. He always believed in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. The seasons turned, bringing both challenges and triumphs. A drought threatened the wheat harvest, but the community's pooled resources and Samuel's knowledge of native grains saw them through. An influenza outbreak tested their unity, but Martha's bakery became a distribution center for healing herbs and hearty broths, with every household contributing what they could. Elizabeth, now reading advanced texts, announced her intention to become a teacher and lawyer. "I want to write laws that protect everyone," she declared. Neither Martha nor Samuel doubted she would. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Martha and Samuel stood where they'd first met the site of the broken wagon axle, now marked by a small monument to Thomas Edison and all who died for truth. Elizabeth placed wildflowers at its base while their younger children, yes, children, for their family had grown, played in the grass. "Did you imagine this?" Samuel asked, his arm around Martha as they watched their blended family, their thriving community, their life built on flower and courage. "Never this," Martha admitted. "But Thomas once told me that bread rises in its own time, in its own way. We just have to trust the process." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of hope, the family walked back to town. The bakery ovens awaited tomorrow's loaves. The horses nickered for evening grain, and children of all colors ran ahead, their laughter echoing off canyon walls that had once held only sorrow. In the doorway of the bread house, Martha paused to touch the wooden sign Thomas Edison had crafted with his electrical burning tool: "Love, justice, and fresh bread daily." Below it, in smaller letters, "All are welcome." And in Ridge Creek, at least, all truly were. The West remained vast and wild, but in this one corner, people had proven that bridges could be built from the simplest materials: flour, water, courage, and open hearts. The frontier's greatest adventure, it turned out, wasn't conquering the land, it was learning to live together upon it. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, courage, and justice in the Old West. I hope Martha and Samuel's journey touched your heart as it did mine. Please share in the comments where you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow Wild West story enthusiasts from around the world. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help more people discover these inspiring frontier stories. Your support means everything. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward the sunrise.